Have you ever imagined how a dream trip could turn into a real nightmare? Each exotic destination holds secrets, and some unexpected adventures can lead you to dark and frightening places. Today, you'll discover stories of travelers who lived through terrifying experiences where the paradise scenery gave way to mysteries, dangers, and moments of pure adrenaline. So, if you love exploring the unknown and want to feel the tension of those who faced the unexpected in foreign lands, get ready for a breathtaking journey. These accounts will stir your curiosity and may even make you think twice before embarking on your next adventure. Are you ready to dive in? Traveling is undoubtedly one of the most enriching experiences in life. Discovering different cultures, exploring exotic landscapes, and venturing into unknown places gives us a sense of freedom and discovery. But there is also a dark side to this journey into the unknown, because for every paradise destination we visit, there is always a hidden layer, a mystery lurking in the shadows, something we might never have meant to encounter. The fact is, when we step out of our comfort zone and enter unfamiliar territories, we expose not only our bodies but also our minds to a series of possibilities that aren't always positive. The unknown, although fascinating, also brings with it fear, a fear we can't always control. And sometimes it's precisely this fear that transforms an ordinary trip into a terrifying experience. Just one wrong decision, an unplanned path, and the perfect itinerary can turn into a chilling tale. Horror stories from travels are nothing new. In fact, they're part of popular imagination. Since ancient times, travelers have returned home with tales of eerie encounters, legends of vengeful spirits, or even stories of remote villages where strangers vanish without a trace. And the more we explore exotic places, the more we find that these legends might not just be scary tales made up to entertain. Many of them seem to hold a grain of truth, an echo of something dark that resounds through time. This is what makes travel horror so intriguing. By straying from the safety of the known, the traveler exposes themselves to the unexpected. And unlike a horror movie, where the viewer is protected by the comfort of the couch, the traveler doesn't have that same safety. They are vulnerable, exposed, and often without the possibility of immediate escape. In this situation, fear becomes tangible. It's a feeling of adrenaline and vulnerability mixed together, something only those who have experienced it can truly describe. In this video, you will hear accounts of people who dared to explore these limits, who ventured into isolated destinations and ended up facing breathtaking situations, and not in a good way. These are stories that show what happens when curiosity surpasses caution, when the desire to see the world leads to paths that perhaps should never have been trodden. So, throughout this journey, prepare to face breath-stopping stories, places where the unknown becomes terrifying, and moments where the thirst for adventure turns into pure panic. With each story, you'll be transported to distinct settings, but with one thing in common: the thin line between dream and nightmare, between the pleasure of travel and the fear of what might be lurking in wait. And now, with that in mind, let's begin our first story. Imagine yourself in a dense tropical forest, with tall trees and deep shadows where the silence is almost absolute. Our protagonist, an adventure-loving traveler, decided to explore this trail alone. But what he didn't know was that by crossing this natural border, he would be stepping into a realm of mysteries and dangers. Picture yourself walking along a lonely trail in a tropical forest where sunlight barely penetrates through the treetops. The air is thick, humid, and the silence around you is absolute, broken only by distant noises, maybe a bird call or the rustling of leaves. You're alone, but you feel an eerie presence around you, as if something or someone is watching you. This was exactly Diego's experience, a solo adventurer who decided to explore a trail in a nature reserve in the heart of the Amazon. He wanted to experience nature in its purest form, away from civilization, and embrace the immensity of the forest. But what began as a peaceful stroll soon turned into a chilling experience that Diego would never forget. It all started when he realized he had been walking for hours without seeing any sign of life. The trail seemed to draw him deeper into the forest, and he began to lose track of time. His watch showed the hours passing, but the landscape around him remained unchanged. Towering trees, dark shadows, and that same unsettling silence. The feeling of being watched grew with each step, until it became almost unbearable. Then, Diego heard the first noise nearby. It wasn't a natural forest sound, but a distinct noise like footsteps following him. He stopped, holding his breath, and looked around, trying to locate the source of the sound. But all he saw were the imposing trees and shadows that seemed to close in on him. The noise stopped, but the tension remained. Something was there, hidden in the shadows, following him. Diego decided to ignore the instinct to run and continued forward, trying to rationalize the situation. Maybe it was just his imagination, or perhaps a curious animal. However, as he moved forward, the noises intensified, and he began to notice strange marks on the ground, like footprints that didn't seem to belong to any common animal. They were large, heavy footprints, but without the defined shape of a paw or a human foot. It was something different. By now, fear had gripped him. Diego quickened his pace, constantly looking over his shoulder, but whatever was following him seemed to keep a safe distance, almost as if it were playing with him, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. With each step, the forest grew darker, and he began to feel he was walking in circles, as if the environment itself was conspiring to keep him trapped there. Finally, Diego decided to leave the trail and try to cut through the forest to shorten the distance to the exit. But as he did so, he began to sense the presence drawing closer, the footsteps coming closer. He started to run, branches scratching his skin and roots nearly tripping him. Then he saw a figure among the trees, tall, slender, with glowing eyes that reflected the little light that penetrated the dense vegetation. Diego couldn't make out what it was, but he knew he had to get out of there. His whole body trembled as he ran, feeling the figure moving toward him, like a shadow stretching out to engulf him. In a moment of desperation, he slipped and fell, his knees sinking into the damp earth. Looking back, he saw those eyes one last time before he managed to get up and run with all the strength he had left. After what felt like hours of fleeing, Diego finally found the main trail. His lungs burned and his heart felt like it would explode. Without looking back, he ran to the entrance of the reserve where other visitors were gathered. Exhausted and panicked, he tried to recount what he had seen, but no one seemed to believe him. Some laughed, others simply observed with skepticism. Days later, Diego still felt the effects of that experience. At night, he would wake up startled, reliving the moment he saw those eyes. He wasn't sure what he had encountered in that forest, but one thing was certain: he would never return to that trail. The adventure trip had turned into a nightmare, and the forest kept its secrets. Secrets that perhaps should never be uncovered. This is how the first story ends, but our journey has only just begun. Next, we head to another setting, a strange lodging in a remote town, where the unexpected awaits our next traveler. For many travelers, one of the best parts of any trip is staying in different places, where they can experience local cultures and feel part of something new. But sometimes these places come with stories and secrets that no one ever mentions. This was the case for Clara, a tourist who decided to spend a few nights in an old inn in a small town, seeking the tranquility and authenticity that a place like that promised. The inn was charming but had an air of mystery. The building was a century-old wooden structure with narrow hallways that seemed to hold old stories. Clara soon noticed that she was the only guest that weekend, which gave her an odd feeling of isolation. The owners, an elderly couple, were friendly but somewhat reserved. When she checked in, Clara noticed that their eyes carried a certain sadness or apprehension, as if they were worried about something she couldn't understand. The first night was quiet, until, in the middle of the night, Clara awoke to a strange sound. It sounded like footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, as if someone was walking carefully not to make noise. She got out of bed and stayed silent, trying to listen better. The footsteps continued, approaching her room door, and then stopped. Clara waited a few minutes before gathering the courage to open the door, but when she did, the hallway was empty. The dim light illuminated the wooden walls, which seemed even more ominous at that hour. The next morning, Clara mentioned the occurrence to the owners, but they simply smiled and said it must have been the wind. However, their look betrayed an expression of unease, as if they wanted to say something but held back. Clara ignored the situation, thinking she might have imagined everything, and decided to enjoy her day exploring the town. On the second night, the sounds returned, this time accompanied by a faint whisper, something almost inaudible. Clara stayed still in bed, her heart racing, as she tried to decipher what was happening. It was as if someone were murmuring outside in a language she couldn't understand. Again, the sounds approached her door and stopped. This time, she decided not to check and stayed awake until dawn, afraid of what she might find on the other side. The following morning, Clara was visibly shaken, and the couple noticed. They asked if she was okay, and she finally recounted everything that had happened over the past nights. Hearing her story, the owners exchanged serious looks, and the wife let out a light sigh before revealing something Clara would never have imagined. Years ago, a guest had disappeared at that inn without a trace. Since then, some guests had reported hearing strange sounds at night, but no account was as clear as Clara's. Determined to understand what was going on, Clara asked to see the room where the guest had stayed, which coincidentally was the same one she was staying in. The innkeeper's wife accompanied her there, and Clara began to feel a cold sensation, as if an invisible presence was there. The atmosphere felt heavy, oppressive. She looked around the room carefully and noticed small marks on the floor, like scratches or signs that something had been dragged. That night, Clara decided to stay awake, with a camera ready to record anything that happened. When the sound started again, she turned on the camera and waited. The footsteps approached the door, followed by the same inaudible whisper. Suddenly, the door opened by itself, revealing the empty hallway. But when she looked at the camera screen, Clara saw something that made her blood run cold. A shadowy figure was standing in the doorway, staring directly at her. The next morning, Clara packed her things and left the inn as quickly as she could, barely saying goodbye to the couple. She never returned to that town and never revisited the recordings of that night. The experience left her with a deep fear of staying in old, isolated places, and the memory of the shadowy figure still haunts her to this day. Now, leaving behind this eerie inn, let's embark on another frightening adventure, this time on a trail known for its haunted reputation. Get ready to find out what awaits travelers who dare to explore this path. Not all trails were meant to be explored, especially those shrouded in mystery and ancient legends. This is the story of a group of friends who decided to spend their vacation in a distant, exotic country known for its lush nature and ghost stories. They heard about a particular trail nestled in the mountains that locals avoided. According to legend, those who ventured there encountered something they could never explain. The friends, Lucas, Pedro, Ana, and Julia, were adventure lovers and decided they wanted to take on the challenge. Despite warnings from the locals, who cautioned them about the haunted trail and the dangers it posed, the idea of exploring a forbidden place was too tempting to ignore. With backpacks packed and flashlights in hand, they set out at dusk, ready to face the unknown. As they progressed, they noticed that the trail seemed increasingly isolated. The dense trees created a kind of natural tunnel, blocking the sunlight and plunging the area into deep shadows. The path was narrow, and the silence around was almost absolute, creating a sense of discomfort that grew with each step. The air seemed colder, and a thin mist began to cover the ground, giving the place an almost supernatural look. About an hour into the walk, they began to hear whispers coming from somewhere in the forest. At first, they thought it might just be the wind among the trees, but the whispers seemed to form words, although in a language none of them understood. They tried to ignore the sound, but the atmosphere became increasingly oppressive, and a sense of being watched began to grip them all. That's when Pedro noticed something strange on the path, marks on the ground, as if someone had been dragged there. The trail was intact, except for these disturbing tracks that seemed recent. The sight of the marks left the group uneasy, but they decided to go on. However, they all already sensed that something was wrong. Lucas, leading the group, began to walk more slowly, frequently looking back while the feeling of being followed intensified. Suddenly, Anna, who was further behind, screamed, saying she had seen a hooded figure in the distance, among the trees. The friends stopped and tried to see what she had described, but everything seemed calm, as if it was just an illusion. Yet the image of the figure remained in their minds, and each began to wonder if they really should continue. The situation worsened when they realized that the environment around them seemed to change. The trail, once clear, now appeared to split, leading in different directions, although none of them remembered seeing these divisions before. It was as if the forest was playing with their minds, distorting the path and trapping them in a maze of trees and mist. Trying to stay calm, the group decided to press on, but the feeling of disorientation only increased. After a few more minutes of walking, they saw the hooded figure again. This time, it was closer, standing in silence, watching them, faceless, expressionless, but with an overwhelming presence that made the air feel heavy. Lucas tried to speak, but his voice sounded weak, as if the figure was draining any sound or courage they might have. In a rush, they decided to run, leaving the trail behind and trying to escape as fast as possible from that presence. As they ran, the whispers around them grew louder, mixing with low laughter echoing through the trees. Each felt there was something, or someone, running alongside them, matching their steps and feeding the growing fear gripping their hearts. Finally, they saw a light in the distance, the end of the trail, and ran toward it with all the strength they had left. When they exited the forest, exhausted and terrified, the air felt lighter. They looked back, but the figure had vanished. None of them could explain what had happened, but one thing was certain: they would never forget that night. The trail, with its shadows and mysteries, had left a deep mark on each of them, and what they experienced would remain etched in their memories. With nerves still on edge, we leave that haunted trail behind and head to the next destination, where a traveler finds something even more mysterious and dangerous: a secret cult in an isolated village. There are places in the world that seem untouched by time, villages so isolated that they hold traditions and rituals the rest of the world has never known. It was in one of these villages that Andre, an adventurous backpacker, ended up encountering something much darker than he could have imagined. He was exploring the interior of a foreign country, far from tourist routes, and was invited by the locals to participate in a local ceremony. Not fully understanding what it meant, but curious about the experience, he accepted the invitation. The village was small, with wooden houses scattered irregularly around a central square. The villagers watched him with an enigmatic expression, almost as if they were assessing him. In the center of the square, a bonfire was lit, and the flames danced in the wind, casting shadows on the villagers' faces. Andre felt a slight discomfort, but thought it was part of the ritual. Maybe it was just the local way of celebrating an important date or honoring their ancestors. As the night wore on, the atmosphere grew heavier. The villagers began chanting in an unknown language, and Andre shivered as he realized he was the only foreigner there. Gradually, the chant turned into a kind of hypnotic litany that seemed to echo in his mind, trapping him in a sort of trance. He tried to concentrate and stay alert, but it was as if the village itself was sucking him into a world of shadows and mysteries. That's when he noticed something strange in the participants' eyes. It was a vacant, almost absent look, as if they were in a state of total submission. Before he could react, some of the villagers approached and surrounded him, whispering incomprehensible words. Andre tried to back away but realized they were drawing closer, as if they were about to involve him in something he barely understood. Suddenly, an elderly woman, who seemed to be the ceremony's leader, approached. She held a strange amulet in one hand and extended the other toward Andre, as if trying to touch his face. By this point, he already felt that something was very wrong. Staring at the object she held, he felt a wave of dread. The amulet appeared to have grotesque figures engraved on it, and the darkened metal seemed to pulse in the firelight. At that moment, Andre decided to act. He broke free from the group and began running through the village, pushing aside anyone who tried to stop him. The villagers began shouting in unison, and the chants turned into cries of anger and despair. He felt he had to leave as quickly as possible, but the village seemed like a labyrinth, each street leading to a dead end or an abandoned house. As he ran, he heard quick footsteps behind him and realized that the villagers were pursuing him, determined to bring him back to the ritual. Desperate, Andre saw a narrow trail between two houses and decided to take his chances. With his heart pounding, he followed it, not knowing if it would lead him somewhere safe or deeper into that mysterious cult's territory. The trail led him to the village's exit, where the night's silence felt more welcoming than ever. Andre ran without looking back, feeling the dread still gripping his body. He only stopped when he saw lights in the distance from a gas station where some travelers were parked. There, he finally caught his breath, still in shock from what he had just experienced. Andre never told anyone the details of what happened in that village. Every time he thinks of the ritual and the villagers' gaze, he feels a deep shiver, as if that experience still haunts him. What he saw and felt that night is etched into his memory. A constant reminder that some traditions and ceremonies are far from harmless, and even miles away, he feels that place hasn't forgotten his visit. Now, leaving that village behind, we move on to our next story. Here, terror takes the form of the unknown, where a traveler loses his way in an unexplored destination, discovering that isolation can be more terrifying than he ever imagined. Exploring the unknown is the dream of many adventurers, but the line between adventure and danger is thin. Marco discovered this in one of his most daring trips. He decided to explore a remote mountain region far from any civilization, guided only by an old map he had bought from a collector. The place was known for its unique rock formations and winding trails, but also for its reputation as a site where some travelers disappeared. With a backpack, supplies, and the map in hand, Marco set out at dawn. The path was treacherous, but he felt ready for the adventure. As he climbed the trail, he noticed that the environment around him was peculiarly silent. No bird sounds or small animals, just the sound of his footsteps and the wind whistling between the rocks. The atmosphere was heavy, as if the place held a secret that didn't want to be revealed. A few hours later, upon reaching a plateau, Marco decided to stop to rest and review the map. That's when he noticed that some points on the map didn't match what he saw around him. Paths and references seemed to make no sense. Trying to ignore the growing sense of unease, he chose a direction and continued, hoping the map would soon become useful again. But as he walked, everything around seemed the same. Majestic rocks, sprawling cliffs, and a mist slowly rolling in, making the path even more confusing. As time passed, Marco began to realize he was lost. Every trail seemed to lead him back to the starting point, like a never-ending loop. The sunlight was fading, and the silence around became increasingly oppressive. The only sound breaking that void was footsteps, but he knew it was impossible for anyone else to be there. Every time he stopped to listen, the sound ceased but resumed whenever he continued walking. At one point, Marco saw something strange in the distance, a stone structure that looked like an altar, surrounded by ancient statues worn by time. Though afraid, he approached, curious to understand what that place signified. But as he neared, he noticed inscriptions on the stones, symbols he couldn't decipher that seemed to tell an ancient story. Fear started to build, and he felt as if those statues were watching him, each with empty eyes and disfigured faces. Desperate to escape, Marco quickly retreated and tried to find his way back. But the mist was now dense, swallowing every detail of the landscape and creating the illusion that he was in a completely different place. Amidst the mist, he began hearing voices, murmurs coming from all directions. He couldn't make out the words, but the sound was disturbing, as if something or someone was trying to communicate with him, or perhaps confuse him further. The situation reached its peak when he spotted a figure in the mist, a shadow slowly moving toward him. Without a second thought, Marco ran, not knowing if he was moving away or just getting more lost. Fear and exhaustion began to affect his sanity, and he no longer knew if what he saw was real or a product of his imagination. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Marco found an improbable exit, a narrow opening between two rocks, which he followed, hoping it would lead him out of that maze. Upon exiting, he felt the fresh air and heard the sounds of nature again, as if the world he knew had finally returned to normal. Exhausted, he looked back, but the place he had left seemed to have vanished, swallowed by the mist. Back in civilization, Marco tried to understand what had happened on that mountain, but no one could explain. He was sure something or someone had been watching him, that those figures in the mist were more than mere shadows. The experience left a deep mark on him, and he never returned to that region. Marco began to avoid isolated places, knowing that some areas of the world hold mysteries that are best left unexplored. With this story, we conclude our series of eerie accounts, showing how the unknown can turn any trip into a nightmare. But before we end, let's reflect on what all these stories have in common, and why so many of us are fascinated by places that challenge our courage. The stories we shared today show that, as much as we desire to explore the world, there is always a thin line between adventure and danger, between fascination for the unknown and the fear it causes us. Travelers like Diego, Clara, the friends on the trail, Andre and Marco experienced this line intensely, and their stories reveal that, often, the unknown can be terrifying and overwhelming. Perhaps what makes travel horror so appealing is exactly this mix of adrenaline and vulnerability, where the familiar ceases to exist, and we face situations beyond our control. Exploring the world means pushing our own limits, but it also means accepting that not everything can be understood, and that some places hold mysteries we shouldn't unveil. These terrifying experiences awaken a question: how far are we willing to go to satisfy our curiosity? Is the desire for adventure worth the risk of encountering what we don't understand? After all, the urge to explore new territories is what drives us to grow and evolve, but it can also bring us face to face with our worst nightmares. Now that you've heard these chilling tales, we want to know, have you ever experienced something similar? What was the scariest moment you've had on a trip? Tell us in the comments. Or if you haven't had such an experience, which of these places would you have the courage to explore? If you enjoy suspense, horror, and mystery stories, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next videos. We always bring new stories, mysteries, and legends that defy logic and understanding. Who knows what the next haunted destination will be? And remember, the world is vast and full of wonders, but also full of secrets that we might prefer not to know. Until the next adventure, and beware of what might be lurking.